Welcome everybody to a special tutorial on our new extended approach stats. I am joined tonight by Skylar of the Golf Gurus, and as you all know, we just recently released the new extended approach stats. It includes all of the proximity that we have talked about in our different articles and on the podcast of late, and now they are available to you for your disposal. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Skylar. We're just going to talk through a couple high points on how best to use the data and kind of explain what you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I've been really excited to launch this. This is something we've been working on for quite some time. And really, again, more than anything, it paints a picture to how each golfer's approach game is lining up through 5 tournament, 10 tournament, over the year, and even breaking down individual tournaments. And more than anything, how we're seeing themselves giving opportunities for short putts, to score. So I think it's, one thing to say somebody gained a certain amount of strokes gained approach per round. It's another thing to look at how they individually performed in regards to pin seeking, because it could tell 2 different stories. So tonight we're just going to kind of give an overview of what we're going to be looking at here. And again, this is just another piece to the puzzle of, the equation that we're going to look at each week. Axis has been looking at this for quite some time. We talked about potentially, kind of a buy low look where you see somebody who's putting a ton of shots within 12 feet, but that didn't align with how many birdies they made. Okay, well, maybe that's someone we can buy low on who's pin seeking. This gave you the Adam Long look that, paid off last week at the FedEx. So this is just something that I think the baggers will really enjoy and hopefully bring some more to the site here. So before I start diving in, Drew, do you have anything initial that you kind of want to talk about what you saw with Long, or as we go and explain?
Yeah, so Long, again, you're trying to add a little bit to your sample size as well. So like just one event, I think, is a great way to maybe see someone potentially going to pop the next week that no one's going to see if their result wasn't that high. But Long was starting to trend that way for a while. So essentially what I was looking for was different buckets of proximity inside of 12 feet, proximity inside of 18 and 24 feet. And he was a cheaper player, and that's usually what stands out to me. A lot of times you'll see the more expensive guys, kind of like what you're seeing here with Colin Morikawa last week. He's got a ton of proximity inside of 6 feet, 12 feet, 18 feet. And do you have just the FedEx up?
So if we go over here, here's just the FedEx last week.
Perfect. So what I would be doing here, if this was like a major, we had all the expensive guys, you would see a lot of the expensive guys that played well would probably be green in all those big buckets. But you see Adam Long here just crushing with the irons, and he just keeps losing strokes putting. So to me, if you imagine this sheet being a little bit more full, a $6,500 guy, or like last week was $6,300, he really stands out as a possible buy low candidate that Axis was referring to. Again, you're trying to extrapolate a little bit with more sample, but again, 4 rounds and you see the consistency there is pretty big. If you couple that with the strokes gained approach gained and lost that you'll see, the cheaper guys will be a little bit more variable, but that's also a really good way to see who's actually been consistent, like gaining a good amount of strokes, but not losing a ton either. You'll see some rounds with Mickelson that'll, he gains some absurd amount of shots on approach, or maybe like Russell Knox at the Valspar when he made a Albatross. He gained a bunch of strokes, but he didn't really play that well the rest of that event. I mean, he played well that event, but the rest of that round, and maybe he lost, 2.5 strokes on approach, which really wasn't that good. But that one round, that one shot of an Albatross gained, 1.8 strokes on approach and really buffered his score. So I like to use a full picture of this, but really those proximity numbers on those cheap guys was huge for me. That was something that stood out with Sloan a few weeks ago. Obviously Long, Kyle Stanley, probably a month and a half ago. So those have been really big for us.
No, completely agree. And, you just articulated some of the value when we really see that. So let's walk through. So let's go right here into the Barracuda extended approach. So we're looking at 2E, talking 2 events ago. So for reference, Barracuda did have full strokes gained approach that we could look at for the extended side of things. Or Barbasol. This should be saying Barbasol. I apologize there, but Barbasol is what we're looking at here. Barracuda actually did not have the extended approach. We did have full laser data for that. It just didn't break it down by hole for us. So if we look at Barbasol, this is a great example. Like I talked about earlier, we have 105 golfers in the field. I think actually 106 with Morikawa that played over either one or two of the tournaments the last 2 weeks that aren't being accounted for on a lot of sites. So for, not only incorporating the laser data, the weighted stats that we have an extended approach look at the Barbasol here. So if we just kind of look through an example, so obviously we see our initial strokes gained approach per round. We see our weighted green in regulation. I think that's also important because if you see somebody who's, throwing it inside of 12 feet so much, but isn't hitting very many greens, obviously they're kind of, maybe lost at some sort of an approach if they can't be hitting greens, above the rate of the field. But so that's why we just brought that into here. People might ask, why is there, not everybody having 72 approaches if they're playing 4 rounds? It's due to the fact that somebody may be hitting hazards. If someone's going hazard off the tee, hits a relief shot that gets them within 30 yards of the green, there's actually no approach shot for that specific hole. Or there's drivable par 4s that counts as an off the tee shot, not approach. So that's why we might not have 72 full approaches or, not 18 per round. But again, this is pretty self-explanatory if we're looking here. Proximity inside of 6, 12, 18, 24 feet. This is simply approach shots to that distance. It's not second or third shots on the hole. It is the, shot off the tee on a par 3. It's the second shot on a par 4, depending on if you are going for the green on a par 5 and 2, or you are laying up and it's your third shot. It's all approach shots to the hole, 6 feet, 12 feet, 18, 24, broken down again by field just for the event. When we're accumulating those into 5 tournament or 10 tournament, it's just all approach shots within the distance. It's not weighted per course right now or anything. It's just simply giving us an indicator how often they are inside those proximities. And then to Drew's point here, so think of this as basically, if you're looking at strokes gained approach gained as positive shots that they hit, and then strokes gained approach lost as negative shots that they hit, and this accumulates into what the strokes gained approach per round is. So again, if you see somebody, like if we look at Troy Merritt, this is interesting. So Troy Merritt, the week before at Barbasol here, had an incredible high rate. It looks like he led the field, in strokes gained positive approach for the Barbasol. And what did he go out and do at Barracuda the next week? T2, barely lose to Morikawa at a deep price. I think he was like 80 to 1. This shows that kind of he had some of those highlights of putting almost 9% of shots within 6 feet, consistent there. So he showed some highlights. And in conjunction with the highlights here, you can actually see approach shots broken down into gaining more than a quarter shot approach or more than a half shot approach specifically. So you get Merritt there. Over a quarter of his approaches were actually gaining more than a quarter of strokes gained on that specific shot, which is right up there with the best in the field. So that aligns with why his strokes gained approach gained was so high. But he clearly had some negatives and some falters there, so that's why on a whole he didn't even, he barely broke into the positive. But that kind of paints the picture if we look at those two. Does that make sense, Drew?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so cool because what people will see is, he only gained 0.47, or he was that per round or for the tournament, two strokes on approach.
Yep.
And like compared to the guys at the top of the leaderboard, or the guys at the top of this list at least, like they're not even close, and he wouldn't even show up on anyone's list. And you start looking at, he's almost doubled the field average on strokes gained approach positive. So yeah, it's just a better way to look at it. It's all important. I think using all of this, kind of being selective of, let's go through this column and take out a few pieces. Let's see if they cross match over here with proximity. Let's see if they kind of cross match with strokes gained approach, positive or gained. I think it's all very helpful, but like that's a perfect example of a guy that doesn't really pop if you just looked at strokes gained approach. But then you go over to the right and you say, oh wow, he's 3.53. That's a ton of strokes that he's gained on approach. That's up there with Anders Albertson, and he, was bettered the field by half a stroke or half a stroke approach. Like that's such a big deal.
One thing, so this is like kind of a red flag. Like Anders Albertson, I think he was a common bet last week. I'm not gonna lie, we were on him too. I pulled the trigger just due to the price and what he showed. Strokes gained approach here, but look at this. He was again the leader in strokes gained approach, but only 50% of his shots were actually positive approach shots. So clearly he must have been, like we looked at here, strokes gained positive gained. He must have had some incredible shots, but lost a lot back, because if you're having a positive approach in the red here at 50%, 15%, that is so below field average that's a red flag. That's something not matching up for me based
Correct.
off of how his results. So he probably had maybe, some hole outs, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
He clearly wasn't aligning with somebody that led the strokes gained approach per round.
Bad example there. But for the most part, you'll see like a Brooks or a DJ, maybe a Paul Casey, and they'll be up there. And the Adam Long would be a guy that fit down the list. But man, he's up there with the best of them with the proximity numbers and the positive approach. So it definitely helps me more with the lower guys. We all know the good guys are good. If anything, it might help you with the more expensive guys, especially if they're going to be popular. Maybe you look at this and like, hey, just last week, he really wasn't hitting a lot of shots inside of 12 feet or something like that. Like, use that as an example for a potential, wow, I'm going to fade the chalk, not just because he's chalk, but because, he really didn't play that well last week with his irons, and not many people know that.
Yep, and this is, so I just flipped over to the FedEx one looking here. So this is like interesting. Like Hideki lost strokes gained approach for the first time in probably quite some time. Last week, almost a stroke around, putrid numbers getting inside of 12, 18, 24. But as a whole, like you look at this tournament was more difficult probably than Barbasol to put it inside of 18 feet. So I like breaking it down by individual tournaments, especially if we're looking short term for it, because it can provide that. Like this is interesting to me because Webb is going to be insane chalk this week. We know he does so well at Wyndham. His daughter's named Wyndham.
Yeah.
Like this is
lives on the course.
As good of a matchup as it can get. And he led, of people who played last week, he led, FedEx in approach. And he was great positive. He barely lost any, was consistent with it. But was he necessarily pin seeking?
Nope.
No. So, is that a tiebreaker for it? One thing I do love, and this will probably be my last touch on this, if we just kind of, break it into kind of the year of who's in the field here. So if we brought in the year and separated by strokes gained approach, positive approach numbers here, this is something that I think is a huge indicator at who consistently is just the best ball strikers in the game right now. So like if we look here and you see, so again, I'm just going to line it up here. So realistically, Morikawa has been so good with his irons, as has Hovland. But you look at this, like this is a group who are consistent ball strikers right here, who are there with their approach game week in and week out. Even those like Gooch and Boo Weekly, like we know that they are very good with their irons. So I think that's a synopsis of seeing who had a quality like long term. You look at positive approach, and what was really interesting. So we've been doing this for a little bit of while, kind of testing it. I went back and looked at this. So I played Morikawa back at Pebble Beach at the U.S. Open because he made his pro debut at the RBC Canadian Open the week before, and he was T14 that week. And I went back and looked the leaders in percentage of approach gaining strokes on the field. So this column again. And that week, if you remember, that week was a pretty star-studded week. Mm-hmm. This is how the rankings went. It was Kuchar, Rory, Furyk, Morikawa, Brooks, Keegan, Lowry, Stenson, Dustin Johnson, Justin Thomas. That was the top 10 for the week. So to see someone like Morikawa find himself in his pro debut in that consistent, stat that I look at was a huge indicator that, this kid's got an iron game. So that led me to play him at that, really cheap price before he really broke onto the scene at the U.S. Open. So I think, again, this is adding more tools to our shed here and be able to use at your disposal. But you'll see this broken down 5 tournament, 10 tournament, the full year. And then I really love diving into the individual tournaments to really tell our story. But I think it's going to be an added value. Please give us feedback on it because we're always looking to improve everything. But hope you guys really enjoy this.